Welcome to the House of Wisdom, Ahval's podcast for book talks on the Middle East and more. My guest today is Noah Feldman. He is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and the chairman of the Society of Fellows at Harvard. Professor Feldman is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. His recent book, The Arab Winter, a Tragedy, asks noble questions about the most noble and painfully tragic series of events in which, for the first time in recent Middle Eastern history, Arabic-speaking peoples took free, collective political action as they sought to achieve self-determination. Professor Feldman, it's a pleasure to have you at the House of Wisdom.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I truly admire your engaging style in writing, and that's especially impressive as you invite the reader on deeply philosophical issues. And you have been watching the region in the past 2 decades at least, and you took roles in drafting new constitutions in Iraq and Tunisia. Of course, your support for people's self-determination is well known. So can we start with your intellectual journey and tie it to the question why you wrote this book?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on any program that's based on Beit al-Hikmah. That's an ideal for me. So I'll try to provide as much wisdom as I can within the limits of my capacities. For me, the journey that led to the writing of this book really started when I was an undergraduate and then in graduate school when I studied Islamic political philosophy. And that's what I did as the subject of my dissertation in Oxford. And from the beginning of my academic career, I started focusing on constitutions. And I was deeply interested in the interplay between constitutional thought in the classical Islamic sense and constitutional thought as it's developed in the contemporary world with its own set of trajectories and traditions. Both the Islamic constitutional tradition and the contemporary Western constitutional tradition were influenced by Aristotle and were influenced by different aspects of philosophical tradition. And in that sense, they have some things in common. Furthermore, contemporary constitution writing in countries that are majority Muslim often includes drawing on concepts of constitutionalism that have become universal, that are shared throughout the world. And because of my interest in these issues, at the very beginning of my career, I had the chance to work as an advisor, first for the coalition in Iraq, and then directly for the Iraqi members of the so-called governing council who produced the interim constitution, the transitional administrative law in Iraq. And in particular, I was fascinated by their debates over the relationship between Islam and democracy, which was a topic that was very close to my heart and on which I ended up writing my first book. Subsequently, I wrote another book after that Iraq experience on what had happened in Iraq, and then a book beyond that on Islam and democracy that was called The Fall and Rise of the Islamic State, and was interested in the ways that contemporary Islamists, especially those in the broader community of thinkers in and around the Muslim Brotherhood, thought about the relationship between Islam and democracy at that particular moment in time, that is in the first decade of the 2000s. Then came the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring events in 2011 were utterly fascinating to me because for the first time, they gave an opportunity to people, at least in Arabic-speaking countries, since the Arab Spring was interestingly mostly confined to Arabic-speaking countries. It didn't really spread to non-Arab, majority Muslim Middle Eastern countries. But several countries in that situation found themselves self-consciously starting from scratch and trying to figure out what kinds of constitutions they should build. And as I had argued in earlier work, all the way back to 2003, in initial elections, and this happened in Egypt and it happened in Tunisia most prominently, in initial elections, Islamic Democrats, people who called themselves Islamic Democrats, loosely associated in some cases with the Brotherhood and in some cases pretty closely associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, had a big first mover advantage, and they won either majorities or pluralities in newly forming governments. And they played a central role, in certain ways the most important role, in the shaping of new constitutions that were being produced. And to me, that was utterly fascinating because, among other things, it's what I had been predicting would happen, but I thought would go a lot better when Arabs could do this for themselves through self-determination, rather than as had been tried, for example, in Iraq, where because of the primarily Shia nature of the majority of the population, it wasn't the Muslim Brotherhood, but the parties that were pushing Islamic democracy were in some ways intellectually akin to the Brotherhood, even though they were not part of the Brotherhood. But there, of course, everything was happening in the aftermath of a US occupation, and a US occupation that, as we all know, was disastrous and left Iraq in a position of civil war. And in the history of the world, no country has ever managed to produce a functioning democratic constitution in the middle of a civil war. I would like to say that it could be done, but I think the evidence is that it can't be done. And so it was very exciting to think that now countries would get to do this for themselves in a genuine act of self-determination. Whereas what happened in Iraq had some elements of self-determination for Iraqis, but in the end, Iraqis hadn't chosen to have Saddam be taken out by the US occupation. They hadn't chosen the model of the occupation. So in some sense, their self-determination was highly constrained and highly limited. So I watched with fascination and then traveled to Tunisia to be one of many advisors on the constitutional process there, and learned a huge amount from watching Tunisians work to compromise with each other and reach a, compared to other countries in the region, excellent outcome. It's not that Tunisia is a perfect constitutional democracy by any stretch of the imagination. It has ongoing challenges that are meaningful and real, but it has had alterations of power repeatedly now. And a decade after the Arab Spring, it has a functional constitutional democracy, at least for now. And that's an extraordinary accomplishment. Meanwhile, in Egypt, things didn't go so well. The Brotherhood government tried to draft a constitution, did draft the constitution, got it ratified in a public vote, which a lot of people didn't participate in. And shortly thereafter, that government was overthrown by the military with substantial public support. And that's one thing we can talk about, just how much public support there was. And the upshot was to cast Egypt and Egyptians back into an undemocratic authoritarian regime that's in certain ways more restrictive of their freedoms even than the government that came before it. And that outcome, depressing as it was still less depressing than what happened in Syria, where the Arab Spring revolution was incomplete. And because of the intransigence of the Assad regime, we got a brutal, extended civil war that caused tremendous pain and suffering to Syrians, displaced nearly half the population. Nearly a quarter of the population was made into refugees outside the country. And in this horrible set of circumstances, the Islamic State came into existence, Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, call it what you will, with its own horrific set of practices, murder, sexual slavery, rape, other things that I think any reasonable person would find to be horrific and morally repugnant. And so that's an even more depressing outcome. And in the light of all this, I thought to myself, you know, I owe it to myself to try to give an account of what happened here, why it happened. And the last thing I'll say about that is that I noticed that as commentators started writing books about the Arab Spring, both in the region and outside the region, but especially in the West and in the US, they tended to write as though the Arab Spring more or less hadn't happened. You know, they either said it was foreordained failure or that it wasn't really that significant. And there was a kind of downgrading of what I thought of as the deeply inspiring efforts of people in the Arab to do something. And I wanted to fight against that interpretation.
Yeah, I like to really ask, you know, that aspect. There is a growing literature on the Arab revolutions, but your work is rather unique in the sense that you're searching philosophical and moral dimensions. You say, similar to Hannah Arendt's meaning making of the French Revolution, you contemplate on the broader meaning of these events. Despite tragic outcomes, you highlight the role of agency and present it as the most valuable gain in the long term. So I got the sense of hope in the background. Would you like to elaborate on this?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I mean, there are lots of good books by political scientists, some even by journalists writing the first draft of history, asking what happened in the Arab Spring and its aftermath, and asking what caused it to happen. What were the causal factors? And I didn't want to write another one of those books. So instead, I wrote a book that's focused on what did it mean? What did the events mean? And that means what human narratives are put onto these events by the participants and by the rest of us who either participated in some peripheral way or watched on television or tried to make sense of it. And so that's the question that I focus on in the book. What did it all mean? And in doing so, as you say, I'm very, very drawn by the idea that I associate with the philosopher Hannah Arendt, that there's a powerful human desire shared by people all over the world, no matter where they might be, to take charge of their fate, to take charge of their government, and to make the crucial decisions and determinations for themselves. And, a philosophical term to describe that urge is the urge to be an agent of your own reality. And so philosophers call that agency or political agency. And there is something hopeful about that agency to me, even where with all of the exercise of agency, people end up creating a situation that's worse than it was before, because it's noble in my mind and enriching to the human condition to try to take over, to try to make a better future for your children, to try to govern yourself and not allow others to govern you, whether it's people from far away or whether it's people from up close. And so that does leave me hopeful about the human condition, even though in the book I try to be very clear about what went wrong and the disasters that followed from the Arab Spring. I think it is still possible to say this was the first time in recent history that people in the Arab world fully took charge of their own lives, for better or for worse. They were the agents of their own fate to a remarkable degree.
I can never forget that I was teaching a course on revolutions, revolutionary movements around the world as the events were unfolding in Egypt. And we were having lively discussions with my students. As you know, the literature tells us that revolutions always reflect no other way out. Psychology, when diverse groups of people do not put much thought about the day after the revolution, as they feel that there is any alternative would be better than the status quo. And of course, in most cases, revolutions are followed an era of chaos in which violence is escalated, and there may be a second revolution, either to consolidate the revolutionary regime or as a counter-revolution. So looking at the academic literature in sociology and political science, for me, the literature proved to be right on the Egyptian case. What do you think?
In certain ways, I think the literature did have a lot to contribute. I don't know if Egyptians genuinely thought they had no other option, but there is part of the literature on revolutions that says that sometimes revolutions emerge when people are actually doing a little bit better than they were doing in the past. If you're really the poorest of the poor and you're ground down by that poverty, you may not even have the capacity to imagine a revolution. Similarly, if you're ruled by a regime that is so relentlessly brutal and authoritarian that you have no room to breathe, it may be impossible to overcome the collective action problem that is needed to start a revolution. So I think the conditions for revolution in Egypt were understandable in terms of the literature. I think that it is true that part of what happened in Egypt can be explained by the academic literature, but part is harder to explain. And I'll tell you what I have in mind. This was an unusual revolution in Egypt because the people who brought it about were very unhappy with the Mubarak regime. That was very clear. They chanted enough and they chanted, get out. And they had a general sense of what they wanted. They were chanting in favor of social justice, and they were chanting in favor of freedom. On the other hand, they did not have a concrete political program to replace the regime that they wanted to get rid of. They were not socialists ideologically committed to socialism. They were not communists committed to communism. They were not Islamists of a non-democratic sort, like some of those who made the revolution in Iran, who were committed to an Islamic form of government. They didn't have, it seems, collectively, a very clear sense of what they wanted to do to replace And I think that had big consequences. And you don't always see that in the literature. The literature tends to imagine that at least the vanguard of the revolution has ideas about what they want to do. That was certainly true in the American Revolution or the French Revolution, which was very different. True of the Cuban Revolution or the Bolshevik revolutions or the Communist Revolution in China. So given that distinctive feature, when the revolution had been accomplished and Mubarak was gone, the question of what was going to follow was entirely up in the air. And first, the army seemed to think that it could sort of control things, and then it realized it couldn't, and that it had to allow elections. And then after the election, the public found itself genuinely divided about what kind of government it wanted. I mean, many people wanted something democratic, but what about something that was democratic and also Islamic? Roughly half the population, could be less, could be more, seemed to want something like that. Roughly half the population, could be less, could be more, seemed not to want that and to be willing to get rid of democracy altogether if that's what democracy was going to give them. And what happened then was a kind of struggle between these two sides, with the military in the backdrop, just waiting for an opportunity for it to reassert its power and control. And when the two sides couldn't really reach a resolution and couldn't produce a civilian consensus government, the military was called back in the second series of protests that took place 18 months after the first protests. And when it came back, it said, no more democracy. You know, we're just putting back in an authoritarian regime a lot like the one that came before.
Yeah, you use Tahrir 1 in referring to the protests against Mubarak regime and Tahrir 2 in referencing the protests against Morsi government. You contend that Tahrir 1 and Tahrir 2 were both legitimate demonstrations. It was people speaking up. So Egyptians chose, they chose autocratic regime willingly, but the possibility of having Tahrir 3 was killed since then. So how could we know if Sisi's brutal regime has a legitimacy on behalf of people today?
You ask a really good question. And I do argue in the book that although it's impossible to know for certain what every person was thinking and why every person was in the square, it certainly looks from an outsider's perspective as though the public legitimacy of the first uprising to remove Mubarak was comparable to the public legitimacy of the second uprising to remove Morsi, who was democratically elected after all. And I say as a result that the Egyptian people, in some sense, chose a return to an undemocratic authoritarian regime. Now, that's not the same as saying that the Sisi regime that has emerged subsequently, which, as you say, is authoritarian and very brutal, is seen as legitimate by the great majority of the population. It's certainly not seen as legitimate by people who supported the Morsi government. And of course, once an autocratic regime is in place, it's pretty hard to ascertain whether it is legitimate. You basically have to do that by looking at how people treat it and trying to see if they are interested in protesting. And most people in Egypt, it seems, do not seem interested in going to the streets in large numbers. Now, that's partly because those associated with the Brotherhood have been jailed, silenced, tortured, in some cases even killed. Otherwise, I'm sure there would be more people interested in that. But there does not seem to be, from the outside, a major upswelling of anti-regime feeling in Egypt. I don't mean by that people love the new government. I mean that I think a lot of Egyptians realize that there wasn't another option after getting rid of their democratically elected president. And that's not so surprising. Now, some people in Tahrir the second time may have been naive and imagined there would be democratic elections in which they would get a leader who was not autocratic. But it's hard for me to believe that very many people were really that naive, because they wanted elections that would exclude the Brotherhood, which means they weren't going to be fair elections or free elections. And that meant suppressing the Brotherhood, which meant there wasn't going to be freedom of speech or freedom of religion. So there was a kind of implicit deal there with the army for a return to some kind of an autocratic regime. And it may be that lots of people wish that the Sisi regime was more gentle than it is. But of course, regimes that have to deal with the suppression of large groups of people are never gentle. It's not practically possible for them to be. So again, that didn't seem practically possible. So I guess the argument that I would make is not that this regime is so great. I don't think it is. I think it's terrible. Or that it's legitimate in some absolute sense, but rather that it is the logical result of what some very substantial number of the Egyptian people seemed to want, and now they have it. And they're not going to be able to change it in the very short term. That said, if millions of people went into the streets, that would mark a major challenge to this regime. And it might have to kill people to send them back home. But if people were angry enough, they still could do that. And they're not doing that. And they haven't done that. And that's some indicator of the de facto legitimacy of Sisi's government.
You mentioned how Ghannouchi of Tunisia was advising Morsi government to seek a broader consensus. Do we know if Turkish government had the opposite advice to Morsi at the same time?
That's a really good question. And I have not read anything definitive that answers that question. The government in Turkey was in constant conversation, both with the Tunisian Islamists, of whom Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi was the leader, which took a very different tack than the Egyptians, which compromised. In Tunisia, they compromised with the both left and right. And the Turkish government was also in constant contact with Morsi. I don't know exactly what their advice was, but I think the Turkish government badly wanted both of these governments to succeed. And I think that probably behind closed doors, many on the Turkish side thought that compromise would be necessary to reach success. That said, the big problem faced by the Morsi government, and I'm sure that the Turkish AK party, a Justice and Development Party, which is a kind of compromise centrist Islamic party, understood this too, was that there were genuine enemies of the Morsi government. They had genuine enemies. There was an army out there that wanted them out. There were secularists out there, or more secular people. Secularist is not really the right word, but there were people who wanted them out. And they worried that if they compromised with them, they would be allowing into their own government people who wanted to destroy their government. But I think their mistake was in thinking that as a consequence, they shouldn't compromise. Because in constitutional democracy, if you just have 50% of the people behind you, or 50% plus one, that's not enough to form a new constitutional order. It might be enough to have to control the government in a parliamentary system where you already have a functioning, stable constitution. But to create a constitution requires a supermajority, a large number of people in the population, and they knew they didn't have that. And so they should have compromised. And I don't think it's appropriate to blame Turkey or not to blame Turkey. We just don't know enough about what advice they were getting from Ankara and Istanbul.
Right. And I like to follow up on this constitution making with broader consensus. You say the Egyptian experience killed the hope for a liberal Islamic constitution for a foreseeable future. You find Tunisian experience for a negotiable future very important. Can the Tunisian success be a role model for other nations or not?
I do think in certain ways it's possible. So, the first thing I should say is when you speak to, especially to Arabs from all over the region who are not from Tunisia, and you ask them about Tunisia as a model, they often laugh and say, "It's no way. It's too small. It's too distinctive. It's not a model." But then I remind them that the Arab Spring started in Tunisia. And so Tunisia was a model for countries to have, the Arab Spring uprisings, which occurred in many places. So it's actually not impossible in principle. It helped Tunisia that it was small. It helped Tunisia that Tunisia is relatively homogeneous, or at least thought the Tunisians think of themselves as relatively homogeneous. They do have non-Arab citizens of Amazigh or Berber extraction, but most of those think of themselves just as Tunisian, and in many cases even think of themselves as Arab. They may be Arabized to a certain degree. So it helped Tunisia that it was not as diverse in terms of language, geography, ethnicity, or denomination as many other Arab countries. So those were helpful. It also really helped Tunisia that it had a political elite that really believed in consensus and compromise, and that the governments that it had had before, that of Bourguiba and that of Ben Ali, had promoted the idea that Tunisians were consensus people. This is what you call political culture. It's people's belief about themselves. So if you spoke to Tunisian political elites or even people on the street, they would say, we're the kind of people who like to compromise. Sort of in the way that in Iraq, if you ask people about their political culture, they say, we're the kind of people who don't like to compromise. We're people who like to fight each other. We get really angry at each other. Now, scientifically, can you prove that these political cultures exist? No, but they matter with respect to how people perceive themselves. So that helped in Tunisia as well. And it also helped Tunisia that Tunisia did not have a major international ally capable of putting a lot of pressure on it. Of course, Tunisia is close to France geographically, and France influences it, but the French did not have the kind of day-to-day influence in this process that would have made them an outside force to be determinative. So Tunisians knew that if their process went awry, there was no one who was coming to help them. So they knew they were on their own, and knowing that they were on their own, they were more inclined, I think, to compromise. So all of those things helped them to compromise. I do think, though, that something that would be very valuable elsewhere in the region is to see that the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated party, Ennahda, which was the leading party through a lot of this process, ended up deciding that it was not going to ask for Sharia or Islamic law to be part of the constitution. Because when they talked about potentially doing that, there was so much opposition from such a large part of the population that they backed away from it. And eventually, that party morphed into a party that no longer calls itself an Islamic party. They say they're Muslim Democrats, which is a little more like the European model of a Christian Democrat. That is to say, they're basically committed to democracy, and it so happens that their religion is Islam. Now, they assured that under the Tunisian constitution, that's allowed. They're allowed to be a party that believes in Islam, but they're not any longer a party that's advocating for the transformation of the state on the basis of religion. There might be individual members who believe that the society should be transformed by more people being committed to religion, but the state is not going to play the central role in doing that. It was a major concession made by the members of that party, and it really helped normalize religious politics. And had the Brotherhood done something similar in Egypt, I think it would have made an enormous difference. Now, could they have gotten away with it with respect to their own members? That would have been very difficult, but perhaps not impossible. It was a very difficult thing in Tunisia, but the leadership was powerful enough. Sheikh Rashid himself was powerful enough to say to his followers, listen, we're going to compromise on this at a fundamental level so as to continue to have a role in politics. And in so doing, we are not compromising on our core commitment to Islam.
And I like to ask a question about the Syrian case. You depict the Syrian case as structurally doomed to fail from the beginning, as a minority group was ruling over the majority, and the state was operating as a police state that kills civil society or any voice of dissent. I'd like to ask you about a moral dilemma that Syrians face, if or when to revolt against a tyrant. As you know, this is also a dilemma that has also been a heated debate among Muslim clerics. For Sunni majority, risk of having chaos or strife has made them side with the ruler in most cases. What are your thoughts on this?
So let me try to give a full answer, starting with the observation that I tried not to say in the book that it was doomed in Syria. What I said was that it was very, very improbable, very difficult to overcome this problem, where the minority government was so closely associated with one community, the Alawi community, that it would have almost no choice but to stand and fight, because its members would not trust the potentially new government to respect their rights. And also, once that government began to use violence and force, it was going to alienate the general public. So I don't say that it was impossible, just that it was very, very difficult. That said, I think that's secondary to your core ethical question, which is, under what circumstances is it appropriate to rise up against an unjust government, knowing that there's a substantial risk of producing civil war, division, and as a consequence, a lot of pain and death. Now, I think that the classical Sunni Islamic tradition on this question is actually more subtle than it's sometimes depicted as being. Sometimes, in scholarly literature, it's depicted as though the univocal view of all the scholars is that you should give in to authority, even when that authority is unjust, to avoid fitna, to avoid division and war. But I think if you read the classical sources carefully, it's often a little bit more subtle than that. And it often takes the form of saying that where the ruler has not gone so far to illegitimacy as to violate the core principles of the faith, the ruler can legitimately be followed. But that when a ruler does go that far, it is possible to support alternatives. And in my earlier book, Fall and Rise of the Islamic State, I made a specific argument about how this worked in the medieval period. And not every scholar agrees with my argument, but I'll just tell you the argument anyway and explain how it fits in here. The argument I made is that the power of the scholars to push the ruler to follow the rule of law did not come from the fact that the scholars could stir up a revolution. They probably couldn't in realistic terms. What it came from was that there were always going to be challengers to any ruler, alternative rulers who said, I would like to be the ruler. And they might come from the same family or they might come from a different family. And those challengers, those potential challengers, knew that if the ruler was violating core principles of Islam, including the rule of law, that if they then rose up and took over, they would be likely to get the support of the scholars and the clerics. And the person who was currently ruling also knew that, and knew that the best case scenario for him, and it was always him, just about, was to say to the clerics, listen, I'm doing a good enough job. I'm following the rule of law. I'm legitimate. So please tell the public that I am the legitimate ruler and do not support other people who are challenging me. And in that sense, the scholars and the clerics had an influence in pushing the existing rulers to adhere to the rule of law. It wasn't a perfect influence any more than the courts in any country can force the executive branch or the legislature to follow the rule of law completely. They can't. Scholars and clerics are like judges. They don't have any armies. Nobody follows their orders in an immediate way. But they contribute to the legitimacy of the rule that exists. And if the rule is illegitimate, they will find a way to cast their support behind somebody else. And I think similarly about the question of the decision whether to rise up. If you're living under horrific, unjust circumstances of government, there can be an incentive to try to produce something better if you think there is a possibility of consolidating some new form of government. And I think for those who rose up in the Arab Spring in Syria, there was a way to get there, but that way would have required getting help from outside the country to remove Assad. And they got some help. They got help from some regional actors. They got some help from Turkey. They got some help from Saudi Arabia. They got some help from the US and the other Western countries. They just didn't get enough help to get them over the hump and actually displace Assad. And even then, Assad himself would not have survived if it were not for the help that he ended up getting, partly from Iran, but then most definitively from Russia when Vladimir Putin decided to intervene in the conflict.
Great insights. Your book does not have a chapter on Turkey, but I'm wondering if we can consider the fall of Turkish model as one of the tragic outcomes of the Arab Spring as well, or Arab Winter. Dramatically, Erdogan has effectively undone an earlier Erdogan who initially collaborated with liberals, Kurds, minorities to make advances against Turkey's powerful generals who long enjoyed a culture of impunity. And ironically, then he later erased his party's liberal legacy by making alliances with his old enemies within the deep state in exchange of one-man rule, he saw. Of course, such alliances somehow doomed to fail, as these old enemies and new friends of Erdogan do not wish a dictatorship, but instead they have been using Erdogan against his liberal coalition. So they are getting their feet back into the game institutionally and counting on post-Erdogan era. Erdogan, on the other hand, understands his losses in this alliance as the authoritarian policies hit hard on Turkish economy. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the Turkish experience.
Well, I think your analysis is a very interesting and provocative one. I certainly agree at the most general level that the early Erdogan was very promising because of the way that he did build coalition with liberals, with Kurds, who were a dispossessed minority in Turkey. And his own Islamism was moderated and kept to the center as part of this. And he behaved early in his career as a Democrat, maybe not a fully liberal Democrat, but as a Democrat who was interested in making alliances with liberalism, and whose resistance to the institutions of the state was mostly resistance to the most undemocratic institutions of the Turkish state, including the military, which thought of itself as the protector of liberalism or secularism, but was in fact not very democratic, and the Constitutional Court, which to some degree felt a need to enforce the radical secularism of some parts of the Turkish constitution, and therefore was also in a way anti-democratic. And then it all fell down over time as Erdogan managed to maintain his hold on power, but sold out his commitment to liberalism and became more and more authoritarian and less democratic, and certainly much less liberal, and survived at least one apparently actual coup attempt and various other conspiracies that may or may not have existed in the form that the courts have claimed that they did. And that's a tragic story. It's a tragic story of the failure of a movement that I saw in 2003 when I first wrote about this as potentially Islamic democratic. I guess, though, I don't think that the failures of the Arab Spring are the cause of this process. I think this process happened internal to Turkey and internal to Erdogan's own political judgments over time. It so happens that at the moment when his alliance with the Arab Spring Islamists, Islamic Democrats, could have been helpful to them, if he had pushed them to compromise and be democratic, that's not what happened. He did not seem to prove a useful, help for them. But I don't think that their failures, and they were real in the case of Egypt, were the cause of Erdogan's failures. And I also don't think they were fully the effect of Erdogan's failures, but they did happen in parallel, and in some degree they did happen in conjunction. So what's happened in Turkey and what happened to Erdogan is tragic to me. But I think it's its own tragedy that occurred on its own much longer trajectory. And by the way, that is not over. I mean, Erdogan may be in certain respects weaker than he's been, but he's still in power. He still survived electoral challenges relatively easily. And right now, although things can change at any moment, there's no strong reason to think that there's a credible alternative waiting in the wings in Turkey. I mean, it would be wonderful if there were, provided that alternative was democratic. But right now, that's not immediately visible, at least not to me as a Turkey watcher.
In closing, congratulations on your next book, which is coming in November, if I'm not wrong.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Do you have any advice for aspiring authors who like to be prolific as you are? What's the secret of writing so many great books?
Well, first secret is read a lot. You have to read a lot. The second secret is be lucky, as I've been, to be affiliated with employers who encourage me to do that. I've been lucky to be in university settings where the people I work with want me to produce work, and that helps tremendously. And the last is to get up when you're writing something, get up every morning, sit at your computer, close the door, turn off your phone, turn off the notifications on your computer, and for as many hours as you can do it, just write. And don't worry so much about whether what you're writing in that moment is correct or is good. Just write until it's a certain hour, or you've written the number of words you've set for yourself as a quota to write, and then stop. Then the next day, do it again, and do it again. And if you keep doing that, you'll get a rough draft. Then you can read the rough draft, and if it's not right, you can throw it out, or you can make substantial edits, or you can change things around. Often my second draft bears no relationship to my first draft. But by having done that every day, you forced yourself to produce that first draft, and then you have something. You have an object you can work with. So that's been my trick for all of my for all of my books. And I always encourage people who are saying, how do you get a book done? I tell them, everybody can write a page. So then you write 2 pages, 3, 10. Everyone can write 10 pages. If you can write 10 pages, you can do that 10 times. Now you can write 100 pages. If you do that twice, you've written 200 pages. So it can be done. It's daunting, but You do it by doing it a little bit at a time.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind as I'm working on my second book. But these are great insights. Professor Feldman, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a great conversation, and it's a pleasure having you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.